Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1.
The thinking atheist. It's not a person. It's a symbol. An idea.
The population of atheists in this country is going through the roof.
Rejecting faith. Pursuing knowledge. Challenging the sacred.
If I tell the truth, it's because I tell the truth. Not because I put my hand on a book and made a wish.
And working together for a more rational world.
Take the risk of thinking for yourself. Much more happiness, truth, beauty, and wisdom will come to you that way.
Assume nothing. Question everything. And start thinking. This is the Thinking Atheist Podcast. Hosted by Seth Andrews.
Now, we're never not smart enough to learn. We're never too old to learn. And even those who get a late start, for whatever reason, can still make every day a discovery. There's a great Wondrium stream on this very subject. It's taught by a psychologist and professor, Dr. John Denlosky, and it's called Myths of Learning and Memory. Now, this is a huge encouragement to me because my 50-plus-year-old brain sometimes feels the uphill climb. And Myths of Learning and Memory was a wonderful resource for me. I think it will be for you. Wondrium is the place you can go if you've ever wondered about anything. So much content on so many subjects, streaming 24/7. Documentaries, travelogues, tutorials, so much more. And if you don't have time to watch, you can listen via the Wondrium app like a podcast, which is what I do when I'm out on my walks with Linus. Learn to learn with Wondrium. Right now, I've got an amazing Wondrium offer to get you started, a free trial of unlimited access. To get this offer, sign up now through my special URL, wondrium.com/Seth. That's WONDRIUM.com/Seth. Wondrium is my favorite streaming service because I get to learn whatever I want, whenever I want. Go to wondrium.com/Seth. So I was reading about Pastor Douglas Wilson. He's got a church in Moscow, Idaho. It's called Christ Church. And they have a mission statement. They just say it outright. They want to make Moscow, Idaho, a Christian town. And so they are strategically going after elected officials. They're going after them on COVID restrictions. They're going after perceived opponents. They're harassing people. They're acquiring land and resources and businesses. It's an inside-out effort to create a church that looks like a town. And we see this reflection of Christian nationalists. They're waging a frontal attack specifically at the local and state level. City councils, school boards. Jack Jenkins had a report in the Washington Post about hate pastor Greg Locke. He was telling his congregants, do something in your hometown, stir your school board meeting up for the glory of God, run for office, that kind of thing. So I want to talk about these Christian nationalist strategies to theocratize the United States. To speak about this, I've got author and columnist Katherine Stewart. She's author of the books The Good News Club and The Power Worshippers Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. And I've got constitutional attorney Andrew Seidel. He's author of The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American. Thank you both for being here. Great to talk to you.
Great to be here.
Thanks for having me, Seth. Always a pleasure.
Okay, I've set it up. Like they're turning up the heat at the local level. We're really seeing this play out in the state of Texas. Do either of you want to talk about Texas?
Yeah, well, I'd really love to talk about the attacks on school boards because my first book in this field, The Good News Club, as the title of my book, is really about the religious right's efforts to both infiltrate public education, but really with a larger aim of destroying public education as we know it. So I want to say that, the attacks on school boards that you referred to, they really don't come out of nowhere. It's well understood that, right-wing activists and collaboration with the Republican Party operatives have really made a conscious decision to engineer panic over critical race theory, some of the, education, about health education and things like that in public schools. But I think less well understood is that this front is really not new. It's really just the latest extension of the Christian nationalist movement's longstanding efforts to weaken and destroy public education as we know it, and then clear the way to replacing it with publicly funded but privately run system of often religious schools more to their liking.
I'm reminded of this article. It was by the LA Times. This was back in like 93, like decades ago. School boards become the religious right's new pulpits. And you mentioned these panic issues, right? They go after abortion and sex education, many of them crying out with the word socialism. That's a great fear word among Christian nationalists. So, I mean, back in the 90s, but I think it even started well before that. Right, Katherine?
Right. You know, in 1979, Jerry Falwell said, I hope to see the day that there are no more public schools. Churches will have taken them over and Christians will be running them. And he also encouraged his followers to run for school board and sort of take over school boards. But what we're seeing today is more than just a takeover. It's provoking chaos. And the kind of hostility and division that we're seeing is not a kind of unintended consequence of their activity. It's really the point of the strategy to sort of demonstrate on the ground that public education is unmanageable and signaling the idea that public education is so feeble and chaotic that you could sort of drown it in a bathtub, as it were.
The world is going to hell in a handbasket, and we've got to do something. Andrew Seidel, you want to jump in here on this?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I highly recommend Katherine's both her books on this subject. They're fantastic. And the point is really, the strategy is so sinister. Because you weaken and degrade and destroy public schools, and you make it so that even teaching science, like evolution, is hard for teachers. They're scared to do it. And then you point to the failing public schools and you say, see, it's not working. We need something else. Let's instead put all the kids into religious schools and we'll just fund that with your tax dollars. And I think Katherine's absolutely right to trace this back to Wayrick and Falwell and the moral majority, and that goes, the formation of that goes to the resistance to desegregation after Brown versus Board, and this is something that I'm looking at in one of the chapters in my new book. It really is fascinating, and I think that also traces to the sort of realignment that we are seeing right now of American Christianity. Kind of began back then, that American Christianity was restructured or beginning to be restructured along these new political lines instead of the old sectarian lines. And I think you're seeing a lot of headlines that are kind of talking about the culmination of that restructuring right now.
You know, back in the Reagan era, we saw the moral majority and these political religious organizations, they just felt empowered and emboldened. Do you feel like that we're seeing kind of the same swell post-Trump that we saw back in the 1980s, either of you?
I'll jump in here. I mean, I think it's important to know that much of what happens in the Christian nationalist movement comes from the top. The action is really driven from the top. It was so then, and it's frankly even more so now because the movement is so broad and also coordinated, and they have decades of investment in infrastructure, right-wing legal advocacy groups, policy groups, networking groups like the Council for National Policy, leadership training initiatives, a sort of vast right-wing messaging sphere that sort of keeps much of the population, unfortunately, makes much of the population susceptible to disinformation. So what's changed, I think, between the 1980s and now is just all of that investment, a kind of unity of messaging and a unity of political vision.
I think Katherine's top-down point is so crucial, and I think it's missed by almost everybody today. You can see it. It's actually really, really obvious. You know, all the interviews that you've seen, the viral interviews of parents who oppose critical race theory being asked to define critical race theory or give an example of it. That is actually a symptom of the top-down messaging that Katherine is talking about and the disinformation that's being foisted on these people. And absolutely the rise of social media and of Fox News have really helped drive this because it helps keep the people in that closed information system, or in the closed disinformation system. And it's not only that, right? It's the disinformation is then tied to their identity. And then even more, one more step, it's highly motivating to them because it intentionally fuels their outrage and plays on their Christian persecution complex. So it's sort of this like perfect toxic mix that is foisted on people from the top down.
There was a recent study, the American Values Survey from PRRI. It revealed 60% of white evangelicals think that the 2020 election was stolen. And about the same percentage, 57% of white evangelicals say they prefer the U.S. to be a nation of people who follow the Christian faith. Only 13% of white evangelicals said they would support religious diversity. So, we've seen some religious moderates, and they're widening the tent. They're sort of softening the makeup religiously of the U.S. But it seems like the white evangelicals are they digging in? Are they doubling down?
I think it's frankly a mistake to try to understand the movement from a larger sense, just in terms of the demographics of the rank and file or their opinions, because it's really a top-down movement. So if this percentage is persuaded of the illegitimacy of the election, it's because the leadership has told them so in all of these different ways, and that's why they're believing it. So it does show the power of the movement and the sort of ideological, uniformity. I remember I was at a Values Voters Summit a few years ago, about maybe 5 years ago, and every single speaker stood up and said, we've got to talk about transgender bathrooms. It was a sort of, we all need to create this issue. It's a bit like the Tea Party. It's sort of, these are supposedly, these issues are made to seem like they're bubbling up from the rank and file, but they're not. They're issues that are sort of workshopped and established by leadership, and then they filter down to the rank and file. And election integrity is their new front. Front in the culture war. Do
you see then in the evangelical community kind of a lean into authoritarianism? I mean, if it's top down, do you feel like they see a savior figure? I mean, we've already seen the golden calf, like the literal golden calf of Donald Trump. I mean, do you see these people who sort of see a savior figure and lean in, even mindlessly, into that narrative, top down?
Well, I want to point out that, evangelicalism, as you and I both know, is very diverse. A number of white evangelicals, maybe 4 out of 5, voted for Donald Trump in the last election. 1 in 5 didn't. And there are many evangelicals who reject the politics of conquest and division that the movement represents. The movement also includes, other groups, many who do not identify as evangelical, some of whom are ultra-conservative Catholics. Charismatics and Pentecostals are really, there's a sort of cohort of Pentecostals and Charismatics that are very sort of underappreciated in their importance to the movement. And the movement even derives support from people who don't identify as Christian at all. But many of them did indeed see in Donald Trump a kind of savior figure. There were some who actually compared him to biblical kings like King Cyrus or King David. And then there are others who just simply made the calculation. I was at Ralph Reed's latest Road to Majority conference in Florida in June, and Lindsey Graham, who can't really be described. I mean, it's hard to imagine that he's a sort of true believer in the sort of all the wonderful things Donald Trump says about himself. But he said, Donald Trump delivered, don't you think? He was talking about judges, he was talking about policies, and he said Donald Trump delivered. And I think a lot of sort of operatives who share that political vision, who are after power, that's why they're all in on him. He could do things that a more conventional Republican leader simply might have been unable to do.
Katherine's kind of identified what I'm finding at the moment to be the most fascinating aspect of what we're seeing, both when she's talking about the diversity of that and this overlap. What we're seeing is politics driving religious identity across the board, so that to be considered a conservative Republican is to be considered an evangelical Christian, even if you are a Catholic or a Mormon or a Hindu or a Pentecostal. I mean, right? And that is really challenging people's notions of politics and religion. I'm writing about this in my new book. There's a wave of scholarship now that's arguing about this too, that religion is driving political, instead of religion driving political ideology, it's the other way around. and that politics is driving religious belief. And I think you can see it in a number of things today. If you look at the post hoc religious freedom justifications that anti-maskers and anti-vaxxers are now advancing, right? All of a sudden, there's this huge increase in people claiming religious exemptions from vaccine requirements, exemptions that shouldn't exist, but we'll save that for a moment. That's evidence of this kind of after-the-fact nature of religious justifications for behavior, right? No new biblical scroll that talks about vaccines was discovered. People don't want to get jabbed, so they're claiming that their God doesn't want them to get the shot. And religion is providing this divine permission structure to justify that action rather than motivating the action in the first place. So it's political, but it's treated as divine. And I even touched about this a little bit in the founding myth from a historical perspective and from the liberal side. We're often told that religion has been the primary driver of progressive social change, but the data actually suggests otherwise, that it's secular values and activists which drive social change. And then liberal religion rushes to catch up and often takes credit after the fact. So to us, that this whole realignment seems like the tail wagging the dog. But really, it's something that we've kind of been seeing happening for a while.
I'm reminded of that line by Hitchens. He said, name a right and moral action that a believer could do that a non-believer couldn't also do. And I don't think he ever got a good answer. That's a digression, but it just popped into my head. Let's talk about this history revisionist, David Barton. This guy's a darling of Christian nationalists, and he's written several books, but he argues that the United States was founded as a Christian nation based on Judeo-Christian principles. He's behind the group Wall Builders, and that's focused on teaching Americans what he calls forgotten history. Now, talk about an influential guy. David Barton was vice chair of the Texas Republican Party for 9 years. He was a counselor to politicians during the 2004 presidential election. He is a darling of political figures like Michelle Bachmann and Ted Cruz. I'll stick with you, Andrew. Let's talk about David Barton and our quote-unquote Judeo-Christian origins. Your thoughts?
Yeah, Katherine can really speak to the influence of David Barton. For instance, his group is one of the groups behind Project Blitz, which is pushing all these Christian nationalist bills in the state legislatures that we're seeing. But when it comes to the actual lies that he's spreading, that is why I wrote my book. That was the purpose of the founding myth, is to utterly destroy this disinformation and the myths that underlie the Christian nationalist identity. The central one being that the United States was founded on Judeo-Christian principles. I do not think that could be more wrong. First of all, you have to define Judeo-Christian principles, which is a little difficult. But if you look through their rhetoric, they actually mean Christian principles, they mean the Bible, they mean the Ten Commandments. And what you find when you dig in and compare those principles to the principles on which the United States was founded is that the two systems are really irreconcilable. And the way I put it, and I admit that it is blunt in the book, is that Christianity is un-American. That's how different the two systems are. So to me, this is one of the more frustrating and long-lived myths that we have seen. The most interesting part recently about that myth is that it's always been treated as this historical question, sort of almost a scholarly debate, how was America founded? But it was never really about that, I don't think. And I think on January 6th, that's when Christian nationalism really kind of ripped off that historical mask and showed the world that it truly was a fight about who we are as a country right now and which direction we're going.
Lots to unpack here. Katherine Stewart, you want to weigh in on David Barton?
David Barton's been involved in so many of the leadership initiatives of the religious right. I call him the Where's Waldo of the movement. One of the lead initiatives that he's been involved with is that he's paired up with a guy named Andrew Womack. He's a Colorado-based founder of something called the Truth and Liberty Coalition, and they've conducted a series of conferences or academies that are intended to sort of encourage, recruit, and train candidates for political office, including school boards, but school boards and beyond. And they boast of using materials prepared by David Barton. His materials, of course, have come under fire for numerous misrepresentations, outright falsehoods. But at present, they are running these training academies that appear to be intensely focused on directing citizens to vote on issues pertaining to public education and kids. They distributed voter guides featuring just 5 issues, among them critical race theory, parental rights, gender identity pronouns, and things like that. All of these things focused on kids. And here's the thing about focusing on kids. It's, kids, religion, education, it's a perfect storm. Everybody gets upset. So I often think of the culture war issues that they focus on to get, the rank and file involved as like these shiny baubles. If you can get people to sort of focus on these shiny baubles that are dangled in front of their faces, then they won't be focusing on the larger issues in play. And, the thing that I think people often overlook with this movement is the fact that they are focused on, they've like sort of created an alliance with like far right libertarian economic ideology that I think a lot of the rank and file, when they're drawing on existing frustrations, many of them, and pre-existing frustrations, many of them pertaining to economic conditions that are making lives for families so much more difficult. The religious right claims to stand for family values, but they're endorsing economic policies that are actually making it harder for families to succeed.
So this is a targeted grassroots school board thing, right? We've covered stories on this show about how there are pastors encouraging whole congregations, not even worried about the state church line of the Johnson Amendment. I mean, they're mobilizing congregations. Hey, run for your school boards, right? Because if you've got the school boards, that's totally a sort of a bottom-up kind of thing, not necessarily a top-down, but it's a way to affect at the local level. Would you agree?
Absolutely. They're focusing on these identity issues in order to get people to sort of behave a certain way on a political level. Abortion is another one of these identity issues. In some ways, it's a sort of classic identity issue. If you can get people to vote on a single issue or 2 or 3 issues, you can control their vote.
Andrew Seidel, we see this sort of easily frightened, would you call the Christian nationalist culture, a kind of a, hey, let's other somebody and let's throw out a fear word and then let's say, rally behind our flag and we will keep you safe and we will empower you. I don't know. Was that an accurate way of looking at it from your perspective?
I think it's absolutely an identity. I think that may be the best way to describe what Christian nationalism is. It's an identity, and they see it as who we are as a country as well, right? So it's not just a personal identity, but it's also a national identity. And America at its most basic level is a shared idea. And I think Christian nationalism refuses to share. So we are going to be faced as a country with the choice, America or Christian nationalism, because we really can't have both. It is an inherently exclusionary ideology.
Talking here with columnist and author Katherine Stewart and constitutional attorney and author Andrew Seidel. I can't have a Constitution guy on the show without talking specifically about the Founding Fathers. Can you give me some specific examples of Founding Fathers who were not this evangelical Christian nationalist icon that the David Bartons and the Tim Bartons keep talking about? I mean, what are we talking about when we talk about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, Madison, Adams, that kind of thing?
Yeah, there's a lot of examples, but I think the first thing to point out in any time you're ever having that conversation or debate is that it doesn't actually matter. The Founding Fathers' personal religious beliefs is completely irrelevant to the claims of Christian nationalism, to the idea that we were founded as a Christian nation or that we were founded on Judeo-Christian principles. They could all be the most devout evangelicals out there, and that would not prove that they founded a country based on evangelical principles. You would still have to draw the line between their beliefs and the principles that they incorporated into the Constitution, for instance. And We actually, as it turns out, have a lot of their writings on this subject. We have the records from the Constitutional Convention. We have the Federalist Papers where they explained why they put provisions into different sections of the Constitution. And they don't talk about the Bible or God or religion or Jesus at all. The first point about this is it's a super fascinating question. And if you get me at like a bar, at a conference, I can go on for hours about it. But it really is, it's something of a distraction to the claims of Christian nationalism. And my fear is always that when we engage on this battlefield that's irrelevant, we're actually ceding the more important question, which is, does any of this matter? Now, all that being that throat clearing done, Jefferson took a razor to the Bible and cut out all the supernatural stuff. George Washington was on his deathbed for a couple of days and didn't have any preacher or pastor come to offer religious consolation. He didn't pray in the Snowy Valley Forge, which is one of the more popular myths tied to Christian nationalism. That story was invented by the same Parson who invented the story about Washington not being able to lie about chopping down a cherry tree. And all these I go over in the book. To me, the better question is not whether the founders were personally religious or not. And also, their beliefs change, right? If you find a George Washington letter from when he was 18 versus when he was 38 or versus when he was 58, it's going to probably have slightly different or maybe markedly different views, right, Seth? If you look at an email you wrote from a decade ago or 15 years ago, it might be significantly different than one you write now. And we kind of lose a lot of that looking back. So I think the more important thing is looking at what they thought about building a brand new government. What were the original ideas they contributed to that? And the truly original revolutionary ideas were we the people, that power comes from the people, not from a deity. Was the separation of state and church, the ban on religious tests for public office in Article 6. These were the things that had not been done before, that were new inventions that America contributed to political science and to humanity, really.
Well,
and they all happen to be, secular.
When, Tim and David Barton lean on the Declaration of Independence, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. What do you do with that?
Well, you write 2 chapters about it in your book and go over it line by line. One of the things that I really like to point out is the founders were talking about natural law there. And that's confusing to people today. But there's kind of 2 versions of natural law. Today we would conceive of them as divine law and human rights, right? You have rights by virtue of being a human being. That's one sort of conception of natural law. And the other is you have rights that are given to you by a God. And those are incredibly weak and fragile and dangerous, because what is given by a God can be taken away by people claiming to speak for that God. God-given rights are weak and fragile and not something we want. We are fighting for and hope to achieve human rights and full human rights for all our brothers and sisters.
Okay, I'm going to play you a soundbite here. This is North Carolina Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson. This guy is hardcore. Spoke at a big Christian nationalist rally recently. It's called Stand Up for America. Let me play you the clip and then we'll comment.
You are the living embodiment of those people. As you stand here today, stand with courage, stand with conviction, and tell our enemies on the other side of the aisle that would drag this nation down into a socialist hellhole, that you will only do it as you run past me, laying on the ground, choking on my own blood, because I will not give up this nation to you. It is not yours. You did not build it. You did not defend it, and you will not own it. We will. The Christian patriots of this nation will own this nation and rule this nation and help freedom survive for future generations. Stand strong, stand proud. Let's save this state and nation. Let's be the people who preserve freedom for the future.
This to me sounds like a call to war, especially in the wake of January the 6th. Are we talking about a literal civil war?
it sounds very dominionist, this idea that this so-called correct types of Christians, Christians of a certain variety, should dominate over every aspect of government and society, calling for a kind of dominion. And what I'm hearing at a lot of the Christian nationalist conferences and strategy gatherings I attend is that certain kinds of political ideology, such as Seven Mountains dominionism, that were once sort of considered so extreme they were relegated to the fringe of the movement, are really being mainstreamed. So at the last Road to Majority conference, there was actually a seminar on Seven Mountains dominionism where Democrats were referred to as demonic and evil, and democratic organizations were referred to as demonic institutions. And is a complete othering, not just considering people with different political opinions. They've got a different political opinion. We disagree with them. We think that their, policies are going to be, whatever, destructive to our society, whatever, but literally being considered in league with the devil and demonic. And this kind of othering is frankly dangerous. And it's a kind of extreme version of what the movement does, which is divide between the outsiders and the insiders, the pure versus the impure.
I look at a lot of this and my first thought is somebody's going to get hurt. And then I think people have already been hurt. Andrew Seidel, are you watching this sort of, impending civil war?
I mean, I don't think that's unfair. It goes back to what we were talking about earlier when I was mentioning that Christian nationalism really ripped off its mask on January 6th and showed that it's not this scholarly debate about how America was founded, but this violent exclusionary movement that is bent on seizing power in the here and now. And you really saw this in the run-up to January 6th, where their rhetoric and ratcheted up, and they had dry runs where they marched to the Capitol in previous protests. I mean, the Jericho March was one of the groups that organized this. It was founded by two former federal workers. They were both sent visions from God to organize, to, quote, let the church roar. And they named their whole movement, the Jericho March, after a biblical genocide. I mean, right, this is, God orders the sacking of a town and the murder of everybody in it. They weren't hiding their violent desires. They're naming their movement after it. To me, the more frustrating and harder question is, why is nobody paying attention to them telling us this?
They don't see the ram's horn being blown and think, this is rather odd. I just...
No, that's all they think, right? They see the shofars being blown on stage, and, they have shofars that are like decorated for Donald Trump, and they have American flags on them, right? I mean, they're manifestations of Christian nationalism that are meant to signal God's wrath in the violent sack of a city and the murder of all of its inhabitants. I'm shocked that January 6th wasn't worse. And I genuinely fear for what is ahead. I really am worried about it.
Still to come, we got to talk about these information bubbles that are popping up everywhere, these little evangelical, right-wing, Christian nationalist social media sites and quote-unquote news outlets. We're going to talk about QAnon. We're going to talk about the Supreme Court. There's a big one. Lots to do with my special guests on the way next. Continuing my conversation with Andrew Seidel, author of The Founding Myth, and Katherine Stewart, author of the book The Power Worshippers. Let's talk about information bubbles. We see a lot of these Christian nationalists, the white evangelicals. They're either being kicked off Twitter and Facebook or whatever, or they've just decided they're going to go to a Gab social, or, I know Parler's been having its struggles recently, but you got OAN and you got Newsmax and you got all these little hubs where they can go and have themselves reinforced. Do either of you follow these sort of evangelical, conservative, Christian nationalist information bubbles? And what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I do follow those, that sort of far-right information sphere. And what you find is that it's growing, it's effective. I think if you look at the number of Americans who have bought into this idea of election fraud, for which there was no evidence, even Republican-led investigations of various regions and states have turned up no evidence, and yet they continue to sort of double down on the message of election fraud. The fact that people continue to believe it just shows the effectiveness and power of the movement. But beyond the, I think a lot of those different platforms bear a huge amount of responsibility. But what's clear is that a lot of Christian nationalist leaders were also driving the misinformation. So, for instance, after the November election, there was a letter that was produced by an affiliate of Council for National Policy, signed by a number of incredibly powerful religious right leaders, such as Bob McEwen, Tony Perkins, Tom Fitton, and others, people leading these various organizations, that was calling on legislators to contest the electoral votes. And this was produced well before January 6th, and they were sort of doubling down on the misinformation. I think after the election, there was a kind of moment when it was kind of a question about how it was going to break down. And I saw a number of very powerful religious leaders kind of waffling or saying, well, Trump needs to concede. And people like Mitt Romney and George W. Bush tried to sort of nudge Trump gracefully to the exit. But then a lot of the leadership ended up doubling down on this idea that the election was illegitimate. That itself provided a very powerful messaging sphere for a lot of folks.
There was Newsmax reporter Emerald Robinson tweeting that the COVID-19 vaccine contains a bioluminescent marker that helps the government track you. And of course, people rally behind this because they've been primed to do so. Her tweet finished, "Read the last book of the New Testament to see how this ends." Andrew Seidel, Newsmax, OAN, Christian Nationalist, social media, the upcoming Trump, what's it called? Trump social or speech social or whatever it's called. You have any thoughts?
I mean, I think what Katherine was just focusing on is how alarming the power of that disinformation ecosystem is, right? And Seth, you actually wrote about this in a way that stuck with me in Confessions of a Former Fox News Christian. You wrote about how if a neurosurgeon had dissected your brain, they would have found a red, white, and blue tumor created by AM radio. Yeah. And that imagery it lodged right in my brain, and it's been stuck there. And I every time I'm wowed, which happens too often, by the power of that ecosystem, that imagery pops into my brain, and that's what I see. It really is alarming. And I think the science tells us too that you're not actually that far off. This is an addiction.
Well, the sad thing I have to say is our electoral system, our Congress, these are the pillars of our democracy. The idea of equality and justice for all, that is the most American principle that we have. And yet these folks who attacked the Capitol on January 6th, they call themselves patriot as they were attacking the foundations, the most important pillars of our country, and betraying its foundations. So
I would listen to Rush Limbaugh, and in a 20-minute drive, by the time I got from work to home, I was lathering, like I was frothing at the mouth, and I was, what's this country coming to? And I was ready to do battle. And, outrage is a powerful marketing tool, certainly.
Well, and it addicts people to anger, and addicts become different people. And I think the science shows that this is there, right? When humans perceive a threat, our brains pump out neurotransmitters, dopamine, adrenaline, cortisol, and to a large extent, we are our brain chemistry. So if your behavior and personality can be altered and corrected with drugs that can alter that chemistry, and that also means that a steady diet of outrage floods the brain with these neurotransmitters, and so it alters your chemistry and it alters you, and I think it leaves you quite literally stupid and wanting more. And I don't mean that in that these people are less intelligent, but that's what some of these chemical neurotransmitters literally do to your brain. You're fueling a fight or flight response, not the prefrontal cortex and the intelligence centers. So it's by kicking the brain into survival mode to face that perceived threat, the older lizard parts of your brain take over. And those decision-making and logic and inhibition-inducing parts of our brain slow down. So Fox News, makes people angry. It makes people stupid. So does Newsmax, literally. And it also addicts them in a way that continues to bring them back every day for hours and hours and hours. And I mean, this is just a huge problem that, Katherine is absolutely right to identify that the attackers, the insurrectionists on January 6th believed themselves to be patriots. They were trying to overthrow the result of a free and fair election in defense of their country. It makes no sense. There is no logic to that.
All I know is every time I see Tucker Carlson trending on Twitter, I know that I die a little bit in my heart. I don't know if you feel the same way. I know Katherine Stewart is on a time crunch, so I'm going to let Katherine go and finish up here with Andrew Seidel. Katherine, thank you so much for your work. I'm going to put a link to your work and your site and everything in the description box, but you are greatly appreciated. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks. I appreciate you both and everything you do.
Andrew Seidel, the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, with the addition of Amy Coney Barrett. We've got essentially Christian majority rule. I mean, how screwed is the Supreme Court? How screwed are we? Talk to me about the Supreme Court, please.
It's worse than everybody thinks. First of all, the Supreme Court's not immune from any of the things we were just discussing with brain chemistry. But this court is packed with Christian nationalists, with Trumpian ideologues. It is broken. The institution is fully broken. People really need to wake up and shed the myth that you were taught in school about a Supreme Court that is guided by justice and legal principle, and even-handedly and blindly applies those legal and constitutional principles to reach the just results, regardless. That is not this court. Maybe that was the court once. It's a hard argument to make, I think, the more you learn. But it is not this court, that is for sure. This court is broken, and it is a roadblock to every single progressive, not even just progressive, every single fix that this country needs, whether we're talking about LGBTQ equality, democratic reform with a small d, the climate crisis, you name it, this Supreme Court stands in the way. All legal challenges to all of those solutions, to all of our problems, are going to go through this court. And they are committed to upholding this conservative, Republican, Christian ideology that we have been talking about, and not much else.
With all the goings on in Texas regarding, the abortion ban, this draconian law, and how the Supreme Court's played into that, and I'm looking at these appointees, I think pretty much all of which represent some flavor of the Abrahamic religion, which is weird in a nation where we're seeing the rise of the non-religious, right? What's a representative court? Do we have a representative court? Absolutely not.
We don't have a representative court from a religious standpoint, and certainly, even worse, not from an ideological standpoint. It's far out there. And I'm going to caution everybody, too, because the court, though broken and though packed and though political, is not stupid. I don't think a lot of them are very good lawyers. I don't think they're maybe the best when it comes to spelling out their legal principles, but that's not because that's not what they're guided by. However, the caution I want to give everybody is that they are politically savvy. The backlash that they saw because of their decision in the Texas abortion case has led them to change course slightly. And they're going to make themselves seem more even-handed and more guided by legal principle than they really are. So what probably is going to happen, without getting into all the ins and outs of the case, is they're probably going to say, yeah, you can, you abortion providers or perhaps Department of Justice can sue to stop this law from going into effect. They'll go over it. But eventually, at the end of the road, they're going to strike down abortion. Maybe not entirely. Maybe they'll just gut it and leave a shell behind so that right-wing politicians can still run against it. Who knows how it will actually shake out. But they are, think of it like this. They are committed to conservative ideology, but willing to put it into place slowly, because they know that the only currency they have with the public is the public's perception of the court as a legitimate body.
This is just sad, Andrew. I mean, I find myself looking at the relative ages of the justices, right? And I found myself saying, okay, so the average lifespan, you know what I'm saying? I mean, if it's a lifetime appointment, I'm like, how many decades are we stuck with Justice X? And I'm not proud of the fact that my brain works that way, but it does.
No, I mean, you're not alone. Like, I mean, and this is part of it. And lifetime appointments were originally conceived as a way to allow these judges to reach independent decisions without the influence of political factors, right? To stand aloof from the winds that change politics from day to day. And that sounded great when you're trying to design a new country. Unfortunately, that's not the way that it's played out. But those lifetime appointments are in the Constitution. So when we're talking about solutions to the packed court, it's not something we ought to be spending our time trying to win on, because if you're not going to get a constitutional amendment for that, which you're not, you're going to end up having a challenge on your lifetime appointment alteration coming before the Supreme Court itself. And we know how the Supreme Court is going to decide that case. The only real solution is to expand the Supreme Court and to do it right now.
How is that even done?
Congress sets the size of the Supreme Court. They've altered the size a number of times throughout history. I think it's 7, but don't quote me on that. 8, if you include Mitch McConnell holding open that Senate seat for a year, which should be included. So Congress gets to choose what the size of the court is. And there was a window when the Democrats won the presidency and controlled Congress that they could have expanded the court and added 5, 10, 15 justices. My thought was they should double the size of the entire federal judiciary and start confirming judges right away. That did not happen. We're now a year or so into that control, and we're coming up on the midterms fast. And based on what's happening right now, I think that window may have closed. And I'm afraid that we are stuck with this court for a very long time. And I don't know what our country is going to look like when we have another opportunity.
Which brings us to my final question. I mean, I know this falls under how do we fix the world, kind of a broad overview, but if somebody wants to resist this rising tide, the emboldenment of Christian nationalists, the weaponizing of the courts, the school boards and the city councils and the mayoral and the governor's races, et cetera, what the hell do we do? I mean, from your perspective, we need a starting point.
I'd like everybody who's listening to this to run for office. The other side is not shy, as we've been talking about throughout this show, about organizing politically and getting people to run for office. I think the people who are listening to this show, certainly the people who came to the book talks that I was able to give in the before times, were very reluctant to run for office because they thought, and they told me this afterwards, what do I know about joining the school board? I'm not qualified for that. But look at who the other side is running, right? Look at Marjorie Taylor Greene. Look at Madison Cawthorn. You are absolutely more qualified than them, and they are members of Congress. So if you're listening to this, I would encourage you to go to runforsomething.org, and run for office. That's the number one thing I think people listening to this show can do.
Constitutional attorney Andrew Seidel, author of the book The Founding Myth, and again, a huge thanks out to Katherine Stewart, the author of The Power Worshippers, for being here. A compelling and important conversation. Brother, I appreciate you being on the show once again. We'll talk soon, okay?
Always a pleasure, Seth. Thanks for having me.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter for a complete archive of podcasts and videos, products like mugs and t-shirts featuring the Thinking Atheist logo, links to atheist pages and resources, and details on upcoming Free Thought events and conventions. Log on to our website, thethinkingatheist.com.